Hello and welcome to News in Depth here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Ukrainian authorities say they have foiled a Russian-led assassination network targeting journalists, intelligence officers and public figures in a joint operation with Moldova dubbed Enigma 2.0. The arrests come as Ukraine marks the anniversary of the Revolution of Dignity, a pivotal moment in its modern struggle against Russian aggression. Joining us is our very own Alex Cadier, TVP World correspondent. Alex, welcome. Good to have you on.
Well, good to be with you.
Right, so let's kick off with a soundbite from a Ukrainian police spokeswoman, and then I'll get your view on it.
Russian security services were preparing a series of high-profile killings in Ukraine. The aim was to spread fear, panic and destabilization. The operatives of the Department of Strategic Investigation of the National Police of Ukraine, together with the Counterintelligence Service of the SBU, the Office of the Prosecutor General and General Police Inspectorate of the Republic of Moldova, foiled this plan. Russian security services recruited young Moldovan citizens, mostly ones who had studied at military educational institutions, and sent them to Ukraine to carry out targeted assassinations. Once here, they gathered detailed information about potential targets and then waited for further instructions from their immediate supervisor, who was in direct contact with Russian security services.
So, asymmetric warfare designed to spread confusion by the Russians there, roping in some Moldovan citizens to kill prominent Ukrainian figures. What are you hearing about this whole thing, Alex?
Yeah, well, it's quite par for the course for the Russian intelligence services. We have seen these kinds of operations in several different scenarios where they were trying to recruit civilians both inside Ukraine and across Europe to commit either homicide, as this case may be, or acts of sabotage across the European Union, including in Poland. This is a standard practice, of course, for those Russian armed intelligence services, I should say. There was a plot, as you said, to target high-profile Ukrainian public figures. Some of these people recruited were offered, we understand, according to the Ukrainians' intelligence services, $100,000 to commit these acts of violence and these homicides. Now, of course, 10 people detained, 10 people arrested, a joint operation by Ukraine and Moldova, but it shows that beyond the physical war, beyond the air war, beyond the attacks on civilian infrastructure, Russia continues to try and damage Ukraine in any way it possibly can, even through these kinds of sabotage and homicide operations, Ashim.
Right, so there are a couple of things that come to mind. The first is are the Ukrainian authorities certain that they've got the whole of this network? Are they looking for others? And the second, of course, is how does Russia manage to coordinate this, with Moldova operating inside Ukraine?
Well, I mean, the coordination was between Ukraine and Moldova, of course, in countering this particular attack. Now, when it comes to the Ukrainian intelligence services, are they looking for more people? Obviously, they wouldn't be telling us this, and if they hadn't got everybody, they also wouldn't be telling us that they don't have everybody, because they'll want to keep that secret. But the monitoring of this, the monitoring of these possible acts of sabotage, possible acts of espionage, are always ongoing in Ukraine. I'll give you another example, Ashim. We've been talking to some military commanders and advisors in the last couple of days talking about Starlink. Of course, we've heard in the last few weeks that Starlink was deactivated for the Russian side, and that actually their communications on the front line were heavily reliant, much more than we realized, on Starlink. So what did the intelligence services do on the Russian side? They've started trying to bribe Ukrainians for activation codes for their Starlink so that they can continue operating terminals there. $500 per activation code, we're told the Russians are offering. Now, the other thing to say, of course, is that if a Ukrainian person gives that activation code to the Russian forces, they will be caught rather quickly because the data is shared. But as I said, the Ukrainian intelligence service is always monitoring for these. These are things you would expect in a war, but clearly this is a very high-profile operation. Several Ukrainian public figures targeted, of course, thwarted operation, but it could have been much, much worse.
Do we know who the targets were, Alex?
Yeah, prominent journalists were on the list, political figures. A crucial, perhaps the most interesting detail is that Ukraine's prosecutor general was on the target list, was presumably one of the more high-profile targets. Why? Well, very simply, that is the office, that is the place, that is the office that is gathering as much evidence as possible on Russian war crimes, on Russian sabotage, also prosecuting saboteurs inside Ukraine. People collaborating with the Russian side will be prosecuted by the Prosecutor General. The tribunals that are being set up on a European level when it comes to war crimes that Russia are committing in Ukraine, also coordinated by the Prosecutor General. That, the most high-profile figure, of course, the only one named publicly by the Ukrainian intelligence services, but this would have been quite a wide-ranging operation. Now, if you think that only 10 have been arrested, it would have been relatively small in scale, but its impact could have been massive, Ashim.
It certainly could have. Now, this comes on a day which marks a rather special anniversary. In 2014, the Revolution of Dignity took place. Tell us about that.
Well, specifically, this day, Ashim, marks the deadliest day of the Revolution of Dignity. It's a little bit dark behind me, so you can't see it, but where we're standing, we had protesters trying to get up this street to be able to protest at the presidential office, protest at the Parliament of Ukraine, continue their protest throughout. That revolution, of course, against the then President Viktor Yanukovych, who had decided to side closer with Moscow rather than honoring the commitment he made to having an association agreement with the European Union. That is what triggered this particular revolution back in 2014. The reason why today is marked, and you may be hearing behind me some voices, a concert that's going on Maidan Square. The reason why today is marked, it was the deadliest day of that revolution. 48 were killed by the security services loyal to Yanukovych. You're loyal, of course, indirectly to Russia, as he was aligned with the Kremlin. We know that snipers from those law enforcement services in the windows of neighboring hotels were just shooting unarmed protesters in the street. I spoke to a veteran actually earlier who was on Maidan on that day, who then served in the Ukrainian armed forces, and he was telling me stories of the people that he lost on that day, the reason why he joined the military. He himself from Pokrovsk, one of those towns almost completely destroyed by this war, by Russia's invasion. So this is a moment to pause, to reflect on how all of this started and on the 48 who lost their lives that day.
Indeed, and in fact, the Revolution of Dignity was preceded by the Orange Revolution about a decade earlier. So the Ukrainian people have been fighting long and hard for their independence. Now, this is celebrated annually. What happens? You mentioned the concert behind you, but I understand President Zelensky also paid his respects.
Yeah, President Zelensky coming to the avenue behind me. It's called the Avenue of the Heavenly 100 Heroes. Those heroes, as Ukrainians call them, of course, who died in the Revolution of Dignity. Now, I mentioned this small gathering on Maidan Square. Obviously, you won't be able to see it, but it is incredibly rare, actually, to have these kinds of gathering in Ukraine, because, of course, if you bring a crowd of people together, as far as the Russian Federation is concerned, civilian or not, that is a target. So large gatherings under martial law during the war in Ukraine are very rarely permitted, but the fact that something even small is happening in Kiev this evening shows you the importance of this, shows you the weight that this carries for so many Ukrainians, the importance of marking this day. People have been streaming in all day, coming to the monuments around me to pay their respects, some in tears, some laying flowers, some kneeling in front of the monument to those heroes. Of course, 48 died on the 20th of February, but the fact that some commemorations are happening, extremely significant, and it shows the weight of the tragedy, a weight that still weighs on so many Ukrainians today.
What is the message that revolution produced for the people? And it seems to have given the Ukrainian people a sense of purpose. What are you hearing from Ukrainians? How is this manifesting?
Well, I mean, look, the reflection on this will be really simple because as far as Ukrainians are concerned, this is when it all started. They will say that there was a clear message from young Ukrainians in particular, because if you remember the beginning of the revolution of dignity, it was just a few students, a handful of students that came out to protest against the president Viktor Yanukovych, to say that they were not happy with the fact that he had decided to sign an agreement with Russia instead of the European Union. He had seemingly committed the future of this country, the future of Ukraine, to better alignment with Moscow and not with the European Union. And that, of course, prompted these students to come out in protest. The crackdown on them was so brutal, so violent by the riot police, the Berkut as they were known, that actually mothers, fathers, cousins, uncles, grandmothers all came out. The crowd grew bigger and bigger and bigger as time passed. That is the feeling behind it. That is the sentiment that so many Ukrainians will remember about this particular revolution, was that it came organically from Kiev, and then of course it grew to the scenes that we saw. Maidan Square completely full, barricades being put up, law enforcement trying to push through those barricades, beating people, and then of course killing people. That will weigh heavy, but of course it is also part of Ukrainian resilience, that Ukrainian desire to be able to determine their own future. It was the case then, it remains the case today.
Right, that was 12 years ago, and many of the younger generation who are walking around now, many in the military and other services, weren't around then, as you know, they weren't participating necessarily in this. Is the message being passed down and felt as strongly as it was all those years ago?
Yeah, I would say that actually this was a revolution back in 2014 that started from the younger generation, and it of course evolved, as I said, up to being a nationwide movement. And of course the older generation will have had historical ties in Ukraine, therefore historical ties to Russia, and therefore perhaps a warmer approach to it, not necessarily wanting to be part of Russia, certainly not wanting to be invaded by Russian armed forces, but perhaps some cultural links, perhaps some family. The younger generation in Ukraine is a much different picture, and that of course as time passes will mean that the majority of Ukrainians over time from 2014 to now have been very much wanting to have a European future, wanting to have a Western future for their country. Of course, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine in 2014 as well, has meant that now it is incredibly clear that the Ukrainian people do not want any ties or warmth or relations with their invading, aggressing neighbor. And of course, that will continue through the generations. But clearly, Ukraine's younger generation, the generation that was here on Maidan, and the generation that continues to fight for their independence today, very much sticking to those principles of sovereignty, democracy and self-determination.
Understand. Now, on a more, if we zoom out a little bit, when you walk around in Kiev, what are you hearing? What's the mood of the people about this war? Are they upbeat? Are they, tired? What are you hearing?
It's a mix of emotion. You speak to people, of course, there's a sense of resilience, because if they give up on this war, if they stop fighting, their country disappears, their families will be captured, will be tortured, their loved ones sacrificed. Death, that the soldiers that died, those who have been injured, the sacrifice of the last 4 years will have been for nothing. So the idea of giving up just isn't something that can be considered. But this remains an exhausting country. I was speaking to someone earlier who said, look, when you hit 4 years of war, war becomes routine. But any routine, if it's every single day, is exhausting. You can only imagine what it feels like to be in a war every single day. This winter particularly bitter, because we know that there has been a massive increase on strikes on civilian energy infrastructure, because failing to get any success on the battlefield, as Russia has failed to do for the last year, they've decided to try and freeze the population out. This being one of the coldest winters Ukrainians have faced in a long time. If you want to understand at least some of what I've heard from people here, it's quite well embodied by what President Zelensky said. He said, of course, Ukraine will continue to fight, but Ukraine cannot be Europe's buffer zone forever. They cannot keep buying time until Europe is willing and ready to deal with the Russian threat. Many Ukrainians will feel that now. They will keep going. They are exhausted, and they want Europe to step up and step up seriously, Ashim.
And how do they feel Europe is stepping up? Do they feel that Europe's doing enough at the moment? What else do they want?
Look, they feel gratitude. I've heard that consistently from senior military officials to people just having a coffee with or chatting with in the street. There is gratitude to Poland, to European countries who have been supporting Ukraine militarily, supporting Ukraine financially, allowing Ukraine's state infrastructure to just function in a normal way. So much of the state is funded by European Union and other money. And of course, I was having a conversation about the fact that Starlink, that the Ukrainian military uses, is funded by Poland. And it wasn't just about the military aspect. It was also about the fact that soldiers on the front line, in trenches, can communicate with their loved ones because those Starlinks have been made available, paid for by Poland. There is gratitude there, but there's also impatience and frustration and bewilderment as far as Ukrainians are concerned about what are you doing? What are you waiting for, you being Europe, to act, to do something, to step up to the plate, to see that this threat is real, to see that the Baltic states are next, to see that Poland may be next, and that the only language that Russia understands is strength. And these notions of having talks in Geneva, the notions of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, perhaps talking to Putin, appointing an envoy for a negotiation on the European Union, for so many Ukrainians that will be seen as absurd because they understand, or at least they feel, that the only language that Russia understands is strength. There's gratitude for the support that has happened already, but bewilderment when it comes to perhaps not stepping up quite enough.
Right. Now, you mentioned that people, saying Putin, the only thing Putin understands is strength. What seems to be a major sticking point in any kind of peace deal is the land, the Donetsk, Donbas region, which Putin is insisting be handed over to Russia. Are people prepared to give that land up in exchange for peace?
No. In a word, we've seen that in polling and I've seen that in conversations that I've had. There is no openness to that. President Zelensky has said he cannot possibly give land away. And it's a basic principle, as he explains it. Why would you give land to an aggressor, to an invading country who is not able to get it on the battlefield? Part of the reason why, from the Ukrainian perspective, part of the reason why these negotiations are seen as perhaps a time-wasting exercise by Russia is because Russia is not able to take these lands on the battlefield as we speak. Of course, they are inching forward, but they are inching. You still have the cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk under Ukrainian control. And so this notion of saying, well, okay, we will end the war by just giving you land you cannot take, it's unthinkable. It's unthinkable for President Zelensky, and it's unthinkable for a majority of Ukrainians. That doesn't mean that there is no openness to peace. There is absolutely a desire for peace. There is absolutely a desire for this war to end, but it has to be done from a Ukrainian perspective in a realistic way, in a sustainable way, and in a way that prevents Russia from invading again. Therefore, these peace talks, not a skepticism, the idea of giving away land that the Russians can't take on the battlefield, unthinkable for most Ukrainians, Ashim.
Indeed, unthinkable. Alex, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there, but thank you, as always, for sharing your analysis with our audience. And I suggest you get in somewhere warm. I think you're looking pretty chilly out there at the moment.
Thanks, Ashim.
Bye. And that brings us to the end of this episode of News in Depth. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.